want. I don't mind. I can wait like another 3 minutes or something like that.
Okay. Oh, well, I'll make a quick introduction meanwhile. So today, George is going to present us PHP 8, the new feature and all the insanities that will be fixed in this new version. You guys have never met George before. So he's been working with us for the month of July. And George is a core contributor to the PHP code source. And we met actually in England when I was doing my presentation about GraphQLite. And he happens to be working on a lot of fixing the way error messages are handled in PHP, which is something we are doing also with Safe. But George is doing this directly in the core of PHP, which is, of course, way better. And since he's been contributing to PHP 8, well, I asked him if he could make a quick presentation of what's new and what's coming in this release that will be available at the end of the year. So that's it.
Thank you.
Well, George, your turn.
Yeah, okay, quick. I'm not sure because there's a lot to unpack, but let's try it. So PHP 8, process and fixing insanities. So I'm George Peter Banyard. I'm normally a mathematics student at Imperial College London. And as Dan said, I'm currently hired for the month of July at TheCodingMachine. You can find me on Twitter and elsewhere at Georgias or on my personal website, gpb.moe. And I just realized that I didn't have a photo as well. So me at 3 a.m. So sorry for the terrible photo. So how I got involved with the PHP project, first helping the French translation of the PHP documentation. I then started to participate in what is called the PHP internal mailing list, which is a list where most core developers or others try to propose ideas, sometimes bug fixes or other related stuff to how the PHP engine actually works. I then proposed the deprecated PHP short tags, RFC, but that's a whole other story, so let's skip through that. I then started tinkering with the PHP source code, which led me to make a proof of concept, which to make a declare statement, which promotes warnings to exceptions. That's not in PHP 8 because various issues, because it turns out most of the warnings could be promoted to errors, but that's a bit late in the talk. So then made multiple patches, and then I got what is called VCS Karma, because PHP has like a Karma system through which Git repositories you're allowed to commit to. And I was granted that, I think, like around in October of last year. PHP is a truly open source language because it has a concept of the PHP RFCS, which allows that. So a PHP RFC is a proposal which affects the engine. So it can be behavioral changes, feature additions, deprecation, anything related to extensions. So JSON extension, Intel extensions, which are PHP specific extensions on the C level. Anyone can actually propose a PHP RFC. So if you want to do it, if it's just a quality of life, a new function, whatever, you can ask a wiki account on the PHP internal mailing list to propose an RFC after you've written it, to then announce it to the list, which has a minimum of 2 weeks discussion, which then gets followed by a 2-week voting period by core developers or anybody who actually has a PHP VCS account, which is over 1,000 people, but most of the time only about 50-ish people actually vote, which are recent contributors and long-term active contributors to the language. PHP 8 is more than 30 accepted RFCs from over 15 people. However, many more have been declined. So not everything just gets accepted. You can see them all at the following URL, which is the wiki.php.net/RFC. And let's talk about some. So quality of life. Training commerce in parameter lists and closure use lists. That's mostly to have better Git diffs. So you don't need to add like a comment and everything. So those are the specific cases which are now allowed. Dot class notation on variables. So you can do that now instead of needing to use a get class or having a weird error saying that you need to it can only work on constant class names. Datetime interface to create from an interface instead of needing to do create from datetime or create from datetime immutable. The first function signature is for the datetime object. So it obviously returns a datetime. And for datetime immutable, it returns a datetime immutable. Non-capturing catches. So that's also, I would consider that a quality of life feature because it allows you to not explicit a variable in the catch statement. So if you don't care about this the exception trace or the message or the error code or whatever, you can just catch it, display a message, do some other handling because echoing is not the best idea, for simplicity's sake. And so the intention is rather clear that you didn't forget to not use the variable. The null safe operator, which is technically still currently in voting, but it's passing with 90%, so it's going to get in, which allows you to, I suppose, when you're dealing with data objects and stuff, you can get into this massive null callback hell in some sense, which is not very ideal. So in PHP 8, you can just use the null safe operator and chain it all together, and you get like the resulting variable. So how it works is the moment one of the values evaluates to null, it shortcuts it and returns null directly. So if session is null, it won't call the user method on it, meaning that it's totally safe to just chain them all together. Another one is that the JSON extension is always enabled in PHP 8. I don't know if you knew that in PHP 7.4 you could actually disable the JSON extension. Not that you would typically do it. There's a thing which is called stable sorting, which is mostly relevant for like array sorting functions or comparison functions with usort, where if two elements will evaluate the same, previously the order wasn't guaranteed. In PHP 8, that order will always be the same. And some nice helper function. So string contains, instead of needing to do a very convoluted like string pos functions, it's easier. Same with string starts with and strings end with. Another function which is being added is the fdiff function, which is floating division, which follows IEEE 754 semantics, which basically means division by 0 makes kind of sense. But that's more or less technical. So some of the new features in PHP 8. So I suppose most of you have probably heard of the just-in-time compiler, or the JIT, which compiles PHP code into machine language only currently for x86. So most Intel and AMD CPUs. So not ARM, not IBM PowerZ, or such infrastructures. This mostly helps with CPU-bounded code, which is mostly mathematics or very intensive computation. However, some of the preliminary benchmarks on traditional code seem to lead to some performance degradation at times. So you would actually need to profile it and try some of the different settings and triggers to see how it works. But that may also be improved before the general release of PHP 8 in November. So take that with a grain of salt. Don't just enable JIT because, oh, JIT performance, opcache, actually benchmark it before. Match, which is a new statement, which is similar to the switch statement, but it has some key differences. So in a switch statement, it doesn't need to be exhaustive. So you can have a couple of cases, but if not all of them are covered, it will just fail silently in some sense. Switch also uses weak comparison, so double equal, compared to match, which uses a strict comparison, which means if you put in a string, it needs to compare to a string and not like do some weird type juggling, which has some surprising behavior, as you will see. No fall through, so you don't need to specify a break. Match is more or less an expression and returns a value. Match condition can be any expression, so you don't need to have like constant terms. And the match statement must be a single expression, like arrow functions from the PHP 7.4 release. So a simple example to demonstrate this, a switch statement in PHP 7.4, which has multiple cases, and the relevant nice example in PHP 8 with match, which condenses most of it into something neat. I don't know if people have some questions about that. Yeah, it kind of comes from Rust. So Ilutov mainly tried to inspire himself from Rust to bring this. So let's bundle all of that together into a more complex example. So 3 and 5 apparently are illegal values, so just throw on it. Foo will get evaluated. If that results to true, then it displays foo. Or disbar. What it's key to remember is that like a switch statement, match will do everything from top to bottom. So if it matches early, it will not execute the other functions. So if 3 is matched, it will not call foo, it will not call disbar. And if nothing is matched here in this case, an unhandled match error is thrown. Also, throw new exception is something which you can only do, in this case, in PHP 8, because throw is now an expression instead of a statement. So you can also combine it with a null coalescent function. So if something is null, then you can throw instead of, I didn't put an example of that. Maybe you should have, but oh well. Constructor promotion. That's mostly for data transfer objects, or just instantiating like massive objects, which are very complicated. And you basically get with a lot of boilerplate code repeating yourself 3 times. So you first declare the property, you then declare the property in the constructor, and then you instantiate the property in the constructor. PHP 8 has a handy shortcut, which is basically define everything in the constructor, and it is literally equivalent. And you save yourself typing 3 times the same thing and forgetting somewhere at one point. So attributes. Maybe you heard about that. Maybe you use them. I must say I'm not the expert about it because I don't really use them. So doctrine annotations are the de facto standard. That would be an example of a doctrine entity. So you annotate it typically. However, there's kind of some debate going on about which syntax. My preferred syntax currently would be Rust-like. So like hash, open bracket, closing bracket, which maybe will be, maybe not, because there's a whole debate due to some technical issues, which are kind of resolved. But so how it works is you have the class name as the column, well, here, and the arguments are passed afterwards. So I suppose for most people who actually use them, they will actually know what they are. So the other possible syntax is the hack-style syntax, which is how the RFC was originally voted in, with the double-anchored brackets, which currently doesn't look like it's going to actually be the case. So the biggest choice is between the at syntax, which has been voted, and technical difficulties, technical difficulties got sorted out by a separate RFC from Nikita, which is parsing. Currently, it seems like AT will be the choice, but they may be like another vote, depending on the release manager's decision. So kind of complicated. Who knows which is going to be the syntax? So learn all three of them, more or less. So the technical details was more is that like attributes are validated at runtime, because the technical reason for that is if you evaluate them in the compile step in some sense or in the parsing step, it would mean that you would need to trigger the autoloader during the parsing step, where you don't necessarily have all the information available yet, and triggering the autoload ASAP is not really the PHP way of doing it, which is weirdly fail late, which is not the best idea, but that's more of like practical reasons due to autoloading that the validation happens as late as possible. Named arguments. If you do some Python, you probably know about it, or I think Swift also has that. So currently, the array fill function with positional arguments. Who knows what these arguments mean? So let's just use the name of them, and you can indicate them, and you can also swap the order. So you don't need to actually remember the function signature of which argument is in which order and where and what. So it's kind of a quality of life feature as well. You can also skip default values by just using the named argument for the final argument or the only argument you need, which helps to not need to remember what the default values are and if they change in PHP to update your code. So that's possibly an advantage. Combined with constructor promotion, it's a nice syntax for object initializes. I can't talk today. Object initialization. Named argument works also with attributes. So, like I think, is it Symfony which has router, like for the router controller or something, that you have like a bazillion named arguments that you can pass in and it will handle it. Basically, that will be done. I forgot one limitation about attributes is there's no nested attributes, but most of the time I don't think you need them from what I've been told. However, because named arguments would now become part of the API, so meaning it's always related to backwards compatibility checks and breaks. PHP is currently, like in PHP source, we're currently renaming most of the arguments to have like more sensible names, because some of them are not consistent, some of them are really odd because it's been implemented like 20 years ago and like the argument name is like just whatever. So until that's done and until the code, like the names are matched to the documentation, you may have like some trouble actually using it before the general release. Let's talk about type system improvements, because typing is always good. So union types, PHP currently has 2 union types. So the nullable type with the question mark, which is equivalent to type null, and iterable, which is equivalent to traversable or array. So union types are mostly useful for, I think the typical example is numbers, which can be an integer or a float. Currently, you just need to use doc blocks and use possibly a static analyzer to check that what you're passing it is actually correct. Don't need to do that in PHP 8. Can just let the engine do it, as it will do the checks. And they work wherever types work. So in property declarations, in type declarations, return types, wherever. Union types introduce some new, in some sense, exotic types, which only apply to return values. So as you can see, there's a false return type and there's a null return type. There's no true return type. in typical PHP fashion, let's not be consistent. The reason for false is because it's a very, very common return value in the PHP standard library. As David can say with his safe library, as he's having very much fun figuring out which functions actually return false.
Yep.
So then null is basically just a shorthand for type null. However, you cannot use false nor null. No, you can't. Wait. You can't use false as an argument type. However, and you cannot use null on its own as a return type. Otherwise, because that's kind of equivalent to void and complicated semantics. Union types in weak mode. Most of you probably don't use it and just enable strict types all the time. However, weak mode is something which still exists in PHP. The handling is kind of a bit tricky. So if the type is part of the union, good. Just pass it and the function will deal with it. Otherwise, scalars, which are in float strings and bool, and PHP internal functions also sometimes accept null, which is the blurry line, will be coerced or type juggled in order of preference. So if it can be type juggled to an int, it will be type juggled to an int, otherwise to a float, otherwise to a string, otherwise to a boolean. Here's a comparison of what I mean. So you have a function test which accepts an int and float to a bool. And various values will evaluate to various things. You can see that like an array or an object which doesn't have a toString method will always type error because it cannot be safely like converted into an int or a float or a boolean. Although there are some weird edge cases where PHP actually does that, which I don't remember on the top of my head. In strict types, you get all the same safety benefits as before. It only accepts types part of the union. Mixed, which is a new type, which is basically everything. So it even accepts null. So I think in TypeScript that would be equivalent to any, if I'm correct. What this is helpful, the introduction, is that if a type is missing, you can distinguish, because before you couldn't very type it, especially without union types. So it's more or less to indicate if you didn't, in an old legacy code base, if you didn't go through this function and you didn't add types, or if this function actually accepts and returns anything. So here are two examples from the standard library. So var dump, which accepts anything. That's why it makes value. And unserialize, which returns anything depending on what you're unserializing. Mix has a slight detail compared to for return types. So in argument types, mix and no type is equivalent. So you can extend it and omit the type. That's due to contrarians. However, PHP will interpret it no types in the return type as mixed, a union of mixed and void. Meaning it doesn't know if you, it literally defines a lack of information. So it doesn't know if it returns something or if it returns anything. Therefore, you can't extend the class or method and omit the return type if the parent function returns mixed, because you're widening type, and that's against the covariance rule of the LSB principle. The static return type. I don't know how many of you use late static binding and how many of you are not confused by the concept. But more or less, static defines to the class which is instantiated or called, not the class which defined the method. So in this case, return new static. If you call the child class, will return a new child class, because static will do that. And you can forces behavior by indicating a static return type. So if we change the return to return new self, which means that it will always return a parent class, and the return type is static, you will get a type error if you call it from the child class. Because the child class is not the parent class. And that's what static encodes. This is mostly useful for fluent interfaces or the WYSIWYG methods, which you mostly know from the PSR7 HTTP request objects, which have like with status code or with like header. Those would use a static return because you're returning the same instance than what you passed and not a parent class or something of the like. And pointing out the difference between self and static. So PHP Stubs, that's more or less something internal, but which has some benefits for user land. So PHP Stubs specify the signature for all internal functions and methods, because currently it was just implementation defined, and you would hope the documentation was up to date, which it doesn't sometimes, because sadly PHP is a very big language and there are very many functions in the toolkit to document. This is an advantage for the engine or for engine developers because it will generate the C code, which does the function registration with all the argument information, which is useful because the argument information is used for the reflection extension to actually provide information. So currently in PHP 7.4, if you try to reflect, for example, the string length function, so strln, you will not get any information because it's an internal function which omits argument information due to BC concerns. Therefore, you didn't have access to it. But now you have, and all internal functions are required in PHP 8 to provide this information. So it's easier to pass through PHP's function to check return types, their default values, etc. What it also means is that now you can add types to some classes that you extend. So the stub for the datetime class, for example, has a couple of information added, which allows you now to type in a date interval for the add function, which you couldn't do previously because there was no type information in the class. And if you would specify a type hint, you would be narrowing the type, which goes against the LSP principle, as always, for type safety. The reason why the stubs have dot comments for return types is because a real return type would force every extending class to specify the return type. Otherwise, again, due to type safety rules, you would just break. It would allow to return a class which is not specified by the parent. So that's why it's only as a dot block. So to ease migration and allow people to add their return types. Another thing is resource to object conversion. Resources is a old legacy type from PHP. Mostly you will see them with streams. So if you open a file with open, the curl extension returns resources or various other long-standing old APIs. Why use an object? So an object provides better type safety because you can actually type an object. You can't type a resource because a resource is basically anything and everything. Objects also have better engine support. And one of the long-term goals is to convert all resources to objects. That's one of the reasons why we don't have a resource type, because if we had, it would be harder to migrate away from it. And how the conversion is done is by introducing opaque objects, which don't have any API. So they are just a drop-in replacement for resources which have better type safety. However, an OO API might be added later after careful consideration. So some notable conversions in PHP is GD image, if you do any image processing, curl, if you do any networking, although you probably shouldn't use curl directly because it's a good way to shoot yourself in the foot. Zip, inflate or deflate from zlib, and the OpenSSL resource to object conversion is currently a work in progress. So hopefully that will land in PHP 8, and I'm rather confident at it because Mate has been going on it pretty good. However, it does imply that you may have some BC breaks. Because in PHP 7 or prior, you could check that the object you get or that the thing you get is a resource or is not a resource. However, in PHP 8, that's not the case. In PHP 8, that will return an object, and you will always show an exception if you do an isResource check. The forward and backwards compatible way of doing it is to check against a false return value, which you probably should do and get rid of most of your resources, except if you need a resource type function that will need to be adapted regardless in PHP 8 because you can't get the type of a resource when what you're passing it is not a resource. So following up on BC breaks, some of the notable backwards compatibility breaks which PHP 8 introduces. Error handling. So EAL by default, you might need to adjust your error handling and your IDI settings. Currently in PHP 7, by default, it is EAL, but it excludes deprecation notices and notices. That's a weird sentence. So you might get more stuff jumping at you. PDO also now throws exceptions by default instead of silently accepting anything and breaking. So if you don't use it, which you should, it might break an application. However, the easy fix is just to pass the error mode silent option during the construction of the object and add a node to fix it later. Locals is another thing which is getting kind of broken in PHP 8. However, locals are a terrible way of dealing with internationalization, so don't use them. Currently, the default locale is always the C locale. In PHP 7, some locale settings were inherited from the environment. That's not the case anymore. Float to string conversions are also local independent in PHP 8. What this means is, for example, if you use the German locale or the French locale or one of the locales which uses a comma instead of a like a dot for the decimal separator, if you convert it to string in PHP 7.4, you get, in this example, 3,14. The issue with that is if you do a string conversion and then back to a float, due to PHP semantics, it would be truncated to 3, meaning you lose information. And because PHP, so within PHP, that's not a big deal. If you within an application, you do a string, you convert to string, and then you convert back to float, why would you do that? However, if you interact with an external API, which most of the time you will do because that's the web, and it takes a float value, if you do a string conversion of a float value where you are on a non-default locale, you could truncate information and get a slightly wrong response back from the other API, from the API you call it. This is changed in PHP 8 to always to always use the decimal dot. It is pretty tricky to find out if you affect it because there's no warning and there's no any setting to inform you about this change. So you might need to parse code, but if you don't use locales, you should be fine. Some other breaks. Warning promotions. So consistent type errors for internal functions. So if you were in weak mode, Sometimes when you passed it an invalid type, it would return null, was a warning telling you that there's a type error. This change was mainly motivated to allow the PHP stubs to exist, because then you can just throw a type error all the time. LSP errors will now always throw. There were some weird edge cases where a warning would be emitted, or a fatal error. I'm not exactly sure anymore. I think a warning, which is not ideal when you know that LSP deals with type safety. A lot of the engine notices and warnings have been reclassified. So mostly it's notices to warnings, some warnings to errors. I think the most notable one is an undefined variable. So if you use an undefined variable, now it's a warning instead of being a notice. If you just remember what I said two or three slides ago, eNotice was disabled previously in the default configuration, meaning if you didn't change that in your dev settings, you could actually go through undefined variables without even knowing it. So, good changes. Another thing is the introduction of a value error type, and a good attempt to list all the functions which have been affected is by Jean-Baptiste Now, which tried to list all of them beginning of June, if I remember, or end of June. Some maybe have slipped into the engine again from that, but it's a good overview of what functions have been affected. These changes only affect programming errors. So something that you did as a mistake, and it should shout at you, and that's what's being done. Because handling a programming error doesn't make a lot of sense. What you should instead do is actually fix the code. So what are the benefits of promoting some of the warnings? So like I said previously, internal functions had like this issue where if you passed a garbage, it would only return a warning with null. But the other thing is, like, if you pass in invalid values, the way, as I said previously, it would return false, because that's how PHP deals with it is, well, I don't know what you're talking, or I can't deal with the information you gave me, so I'm returning false, which is slightly inconvenient in regards to type safety, because you need to always deal, oh, okay, is that a possible false return value? If yeah, like fix it or not. So that's the change. So you get type errors and you get value errors, meaning you can clean up the return value. So a string length will always return an int, and array fill will always return an array. And if not, it will break and it will shout at you. So you don't need to actually check for all the false return values. What stays the same are things which are not in your control. So environment, like a file which does not exist, or other, doesn't change. Okay, slight lie. The message actually changed. If you know your messages, you maybe will spot it. I'll let you like a minute so that I can drink a bit. Okay, I don't know if anybody tried. It's pretty sneaky. It's just that messages are capitalized in PHP 8. So, numeric strings. I don't know if you know about them. There are strings which look like numbers. So, 12, 15.6, 5e6, or with spaces. PHP also a concept of leading numeric strings, which are strings which start like a number, however end with gibberish. And then you've got non-numeric strings, which are basically just strings. Leading numeric strings emit an E notice that a non-world numeric string has been encountered. However, if you notice something, leading white spaces and trailing white spaces are not considered the same. So a leading white space is considered more numeric than a trailing white space. This is important because PHP uses them all the time. So in type declarations in weak mode, there is numeric function. String-to-string comparisons, arithmetic and bitwise operations, the increment and decrement operations, and string offsets. However, not array offsets, because array offsets have different semantics, which are actually more sane. So we won't talk about them. So trying to bring back sanity in this whole mess, I spent actually way too much time on it. The too long didn't read is that all the E notices get promoted to E warnings, with still preserving the values, and all the E warnings get promoted to a type error. Basically, that's more or less a comparison. So leading and trailing white spaces become symmetric, so they drop notices. So if you have a number which has a trailing white space and doesn't emit a notice anymore and just accepts normally, if you have a leading numeric string, to ease the backwards to ease the migration to PHP 8, these are still accepted. However, will now emit an E warning. Like arithmetic strings, so has the same semantics. However, if you try to do addition or any other operation with a string, you will get a type error. One notable example, or one notable case, is the empty string will also emit a type error. So if you do 123 plus an empty string, because you got that value from a database or somewhere and you expected it to be 0, then you will get a type error. Because I think PHP deals with nulls, sometimes by casting it like database nulls into empty strings and not actually PHP nulls. So that's probably the biggest case where that might bite you and you need to look at it. And string comparisons are slightly more reasonable, that with the sense that like leading and trailing spaces are and behave the same way. Talking about comparisons, string to numbers. Who knows what that is going to return? But you can talk or send a message.
I'd say true.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it does. It's like,
yeah.
Why? The reason for that is that radom 0 is actually equal to foo. And the reason for that is that their comparisons to numbers are always performed numerically. So PHP will basically typecast the string to an int silently for all the benefits which it doesn't entail. So Nikita put forward an RFC to try to bring back sanity again, where strings, so if it's a numeric string, as defined by the previous section, then it will do the comparison numerically. However, if the string is not numeric, it will then make the comparison as a string. So for the 0 is equal foo case, what will now happen is that 0 gets typecasted to a string, and then it tries to compare the string 0 to foo, which is obviously not the same, and so it will return false. That also affects the empty case, like the empty string case, which is maybe the only one which you maybe cared about. And also, leading numeric strings will have the same issue, as in they will be not considered numeric and will then return false in PHP 8.
George, I have just a small question.
Sure.
If you've got a string that is both with leading and trailing white spaces, is it considered numeric?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Cool.
whatever leading spaces or leading white spaces or trailing white spaces are considered numeric. So in PHP 7.4, only leading white spaces would consider it as a numeric string.
Got it.
So now it's symmetrical. So you can have in front and after it. Some other BC breaks, which I think I should mention, but I'm already running short on time. So the precedence of the concatenation operator, that's a deprecation warning in PHP 7.4, so you should be aware of it. Default values before mandatory ones are now deprecated. The only exceptions to that is if you use a null default value, because that was a way to make nullable arguments prior to PHP 7.1. So that's the only case which is still more or less accepted. Final on private methods, except on construct, because special semantics, which have explicit reason, but like final and private method doesn't make sense because the private method can only be reached by the class, not from exterior, and cannot be inherited. So that's one of the changes. Namespaces as a single token, that's more or less catches bugs, because you could have if you forgot a semicolon, you could actually call a namespace function instead of just a normal function. But if you want to see the full list of BC breaks, before the migration guide is actually written, everything is written in the upgrading documents, which you can find at the root of the PHP source. I don't know if we have time to talk about some performance gains. Should be rather quick. So the string to lower function now has a special implementation when using the C locale, which is the default one now. So if you need to do any case insensitive operation, instead of using to upper, you should use to lower, because that's how the engine deals with them, and that's why only to lower has a special implementation. Array slice, I'm not sure how practical that is and how much this is going to actually be used. However, one interesting tidbit seems to be that the removal of old-style constructors, so constructors which had a function name which was the same as the class name. That's how PHP 4, so ages ago, did constructors. And those have been removed in PHP 8. That seems, from one article, to yield a 20% performance increase in WordPress, which is pretty insane. But don't take my word for it. Do some more benchmarks before. And there are some micro optimizations, which, as a disclaimer, I have never tried them. I didn't compare them. So who knows if that actually does something for you. But they are here. So x triple equal to null is now optimized to is null, because in PHP everything is a function, more or less. So is null was actually faster, or generated a better opcode in the engine. Instance off checks have also been optimized a bit, so they should be maybe slightly faster. Int and float strict comparisons should be faster, because weirdly they went through a slow pass and it was just a copy of the implementation of double equal, which is kind of weird. And this scalar check is also optimized, and return types are now optimized. So the checking of them. Prior to that, only argument types were actually optimized. So weirdly enough, sometimes dropping return types would bring you better performance, which hopefully will not be the case in PHP 8. And I'm now finished. So thank you for listening to me for about 40 minutes. If anybody has questions, I maybe can answer them.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. It was really cool.
It was very interesting. Thank you.
No worries. I'm glad to be here.
Anyone has any questions?
Not yet.
Yeah, okay.
So it get released in, I think, currently it should be like 26th of November. Alpha 3 has been tagged or has been released yesterday. The first beta release, which also implies feature freeze, is getting released on the 4th of August, I think. Until where there are a couple more beta releases, which will get done until September, where September starts the the release candidate cycle. There will be 5 release candidates, and if everything goes well, and the fifth release candidate doesn't have that many bugs or no bugs, PHP will be tagged, and that's when it will get released. So maybe try to test it to find out bugs, because it's better to do it during the testing cycle than see bugs fixed in PHP 8.0.4.
For how long are you working contributing to the core PHP?
About 9 months, I think, like since September last year.
Okay.
Like the PHP engine is so it's written in C, but it has a whole C macro layer, which sometimes makes it a bit hard to navigate. But if you look at an extension code, so if you go just to the PHP SRC Git repository and you go to extension folder and you open any extension, if you just read through it, it's relatively easy to follow what's going on, because you have like these massive macros which define a PHP function and the name of a function, or some ways of how to get the return, like how to get the argument types and everything. So reading it is relatively easy in some sense until you get into more of the intricacy of the engine.
Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
As a library developer, when do you think we should start testing PHP 8?
ASAP. So how you can do that is by, well, you can open like a nightly, on CI, you can open a nightly release or like image, and you just need to ignore platform requirements on Composer, so that you can see how to see if it actually works.
Yes, my question was more, when do you think we should get started testing it in order to not have too many BC breaks? Should we wait to the release candidate, maybe the beta?
Yeah, feature freeze I think is a good time. So in 2 weeks, because with feature freeze, well, nothing is going to be added. So all the features are established, so you can know what to use. The only one I would be a bit wary about is like attributes.
Yes, exactly. Okay.
Due to syntax discussions. But from when the first release candidate is tagged, the attribute syntax would be set in stone. So whatever is currently in the engine would be what the attribute syntax would be.
Cool. Okay.
Any other questions, or shall we just end it here?
I think we're done. Okay.
What's your preferred new feature in PHP 8?
Oh, preferred new feature in PHP. I think match. Match is probably the one. because it has like a bunch of helpful things, like it to prevent you like shooting yourself in the foot. Like for example, with the comparison example, where if you do an in array like 0, you get the same thing with a switch statement currently, because everything is done weekly, like it's weekly typed or weekly compared. Whereas like match gives you like a certain guarantee that what I'm comparing at is actually a string or actually an integer.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Okay, so
Okay.
Yeah.
thank you very much. It was very interesting, very promising. I'm looking forward to test this new version.
Yeah, I've seen some smiles around me when you were presenting the new feature, and I'm pretty sure a lot of us are awaiting PHP 8 quite.
You can already test it.
Yes.
You can already test it. Maybe not put it into production, although I think I've seen somewhere on Twitter when the Alpha 1 was tagged, they already run it in production, so I wouldn't do that.
It was Matinapoli probably.
But yeah, like if you're doing a new version or if you want to test it, that's probably you can try it on PHP 8.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really, really cool.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.